have a great story to tell, and we should keep telling that story to our children and let our children keep telling to their children so that this tradition can be remembered, can keep going. All right, our next speaker is Stephen. Now you're going to tell your story. He has a tremendous story talking about his father.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be here to represent my father's legacy and a little bit of a backstory. The man that led the Flying Tigers should be mentioned again. His name was Claire Lee Chenault, and he was a captain in the Army Air Corps, and he had ideas about flying that those in the Air Corps thought were kind of wild, they didn't want to hear it. They had their vision of how air power could be used to defend the country, to attack bombers. And so that man didn't do very well, and he had to leave the Army Air Corps, but he was a very good pilot, and he had what you might think of as the Blue Angels of their time. And they were the daring young man and the flying trapeze, and they showed what could be done with planes flying together. And they happened to meet someone from China who said, you know, China really needs your help, and your vision about flying can be very important, so we would like to invite you to come to China. And this happened in 1936. Claire Chenault went to China, and he stayed there for many years, and he studied the Japanese tactics, and he was able to use those things that he learned when the Flying Tigers was formed. Now, the Flying Tigers was a secret. It wasn't that we were not at war. Pearl Harbor had not happened. But President Roosevelt and his cabinet saw the opportunity. There was a need to help Japan, help against Japan, help China. And so they had a secret. They were able to get 100 planes, 100 pilots, and 10 instructor pilots. Now, my father was one of those 10 instructor pilots. He did not go to China necessarily to fight. He was a teacher. So he went to teach. The plan was to teach the Chinese to fly. And this was something that General Chenault had tried to do, but was not so successful. And my father was there making plans. He was in Yunnan and later in Kunming when the first wave of Japanese bombers that were pushed out of the sky by the Flying Tigers on December 20th, 1941. Now, my father stayed in China as a Flying Tiger. They were a volunteer group, and they were only there for 1 year. Afterwards, they were free citizens. They had fulfilled their obligations to the military, but the military never honored them as veterans until almost 50 years later. And in fact, they were heroic and celebrated, but could not have a flag placed on their tombstone as a veteran. So my father decided to stay in China. He was part of the airlift, the Hump airlift, which delivered supplies from India into China because there was no way after the Burma Road fell for supplies to get to these pilots that were there. And he decided to stay after the war ended. And he moved with my mother to Shanghai, and my two oldest brothers were born in Shanghai. And so I grew up as the youngest of 4 sons, knowing all these stories. And I was fortunate over 12 years ago to travel to China for the first time. And I traveled to Beijing, and we were welcomed and honored. And I always remembered that none of this would have been possible without the extensive efforts of the Chinese people, because they built runways where there were no runways. When the runways were bombed by the Japanese, families went out and they filled in the craters and they filled in the holes so the planes could land. And the people that saved the Doolittle Raiders pilots, they are the unsung heroes of this story, because oftentimes the pilots get the glory, but it doesn't happen without the mechanics. It doesn't happen without the people that make sure there's food, make sure there's shelter, make sure all the things that keep the pilots in the air happen. And it cannot be done without the people and specifically the Chinese people. It was their effort, their inspiration, I think, that inspired the men to come to China to help in the effort. And in these ways, these memories continue. And as the youngest son of my father, I'm here honored to share this history. And it's amazing how many people in China know this history, but how few in the United States know this history. So we must keep telling this story, and I thank you.